Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for January 17th, 2017. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined online by Jim Clausing. Hey Jim, how's it going?
It's going well. Good to be back on the show.
Well, it's good to have you back, and I understand you have some interesting Microsoft news that we're going to cover in a few minutes, so thanks for joining this week. And also on the couch we have Matt Kaiser, one of our premier security analysts. How's it going, Matt?
Pretty good. So I can't keep it straight.
Premiere, that makes you laugh?
It's a bit much.
Well, we premiere you all the time on the show.
Okay.
And in a Freaky Friday moment, where Ed McMahon and Johnny Carson have switched seats, we have Brian Rexroad on the couch this week. How's it going, Brian?
It's my pleasure to be here. I thought I'd try out being a guest for a bit here and learn from an expert in hosting the program. So
Oh, right.
glad to be here.
And I'm John Hogoboom, of course, and let's jump into the first story. And I think it's one that you were looking at, Matt, that had to do with some new techniques to trick users into clicking on links that, something with Gmail, I guess, were phishing.
So this article is kind of interesting. A company called Wordfence put out a blog post describing a phishing attack where you ever use Gmail and they've got icons at the bottom of the mail when you have an attachment, a little square thing. And you click it, and usually it goes to it'll download the file from Google Drive or whatever it happens to be. But in this case, clicking that actually opens up what's called a URI, a data URI. It's got a format of data:text/HTML, and then the contents after that. And we were talking before the show. You've seen that used on websites. So if you want to embed an entire image without using an external file, you can use this and put the contents of that file after that little URI header at the start, and it contains it all within the one file, which is kind of a neat trick. But here what they're containing is actually an HTML web page made to look like the Google login prompt. So, and the way that they do it is the very start of that data, if you've got an HTML file, it only renders what's in the tags. So they're putting something that looks like the URL for Google.
Yeah, I noticed on the example you show here.
Yep. So it's kind of neat. So they have the data text HTML header, comma, HTTPS accounts to google.com, but after that a whole bunch of spaces, and then the HTML content starts, and that's what gets rendered in the in the browser. So it looks like you're actually at the Google login prompt.
So as a user, you see the URL that looks like it's the right place, but it's not really.
Right, and so that's the trick. That's the thing to look out for, is that the very start of it has that data:text/HTML. If you see anything that looks like that's not HTTP or HTTPS or anything you're used to looking for, stop and look for a second.
Right at the beginning. If it's not right at the beginning like that, that's an indicator of
problem. And the article goes on to say these are the things you should be used to looking for, especially if you're logging to a site like Google or Gmail. They would have an HTTPS setup, and you look for the little green icon there instead of this whatever text.html junk at the beginning. It's another thing to look out for that people may not be aware of, that it exists in the first place. So I thought I'd share it.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce the point. Anytime you're logging into a web page, it doesn't matter who you're logging in with. Anytime you're logging in on a web page, it should have the green icon indicating that it's an encrypted session.
Right. With a valid certificate, hopefully, too.
With a valid certificate, yeah. When you start getting certificate complaints, you want to really think twice about whether that's a valid site or not. Occasionally sites will have an expired certificate. I guess in that case, what I recommend is come back later.
or
send them an email and say, hey, update your SSL certificate, expired.
But it's true, if someone was to make a phishing site that had a valid SSL cert, you'd have to be extra careful to look for that, and it's not as easy to tell. But if you see this data text HTML at the start, that should be a red flag to anybody.
Yeah. That should be pretty obvious. Although, you never know. Sometimes you're just not paying attention, or you're going fast, or it's first thing in the morning, and you're just cruising through your email, and you get snagged. So you got to be wary at all times when you're, especially as these attackers come up with new methods to try to trick you. So that's a good one. Thanks for bringing that to our attention. So the next story we have is something you were looking at, Jim, and Microsoft's making some changes to the Microsoft Tuesday, I guess, it sounds like.
Yeah, they actually made some changes in the fall that I'm not sure if we ever really talked about them. But they're making some changes in February that are going to be a radical change from what they've been doing since 1998. When they rolled out Windows 10, one of the things that Microsoft did was they said essentially, basically, you were going to get all of the updates in a bundle. You wouldn't be able to pick and choose. If there were 7 patches this month, you'd have to apply them all or nothing. And then they started doing that for Windows 7 and Windows 8 in, I think, October or something like that. Mm-hmm. So Microsoft's point was, if it's all or nothing, then why are we doing 14 bulletins for patches? We'll just do one page that contains information for all of them. And so what we've been used to since 1998 of all of the bulletins for the various things that are getting patched, starting in February, on February 14th, I think, is whatever the second Tuesday of February is, they're not going to send out a bunch of bulletins. You're not going to see MS 017-005678 whatever. They're putting all of the information from the updates in what they're calling the Security Updates Guide, which is a web page that they've actually been running for a couple of months alongside the old bulletins, which is supposed to be the one place to go look. You can still find the KB, the knowledge base documents for each of the individual bugs that are being patched. But, since it's an all or nothing thing, they're just putting them in this one spot and not doing the multiple bulletins. In theory, that sounds good. The guy who was interviewed for the Computer World article, Chris Gettle from Shavlik, is a little concerned. He said he's been, for the last couple of months, comparing what's in the bulletins with what's on this Security Updates Guide page. And as of the Patch Tuesday in January, there were some things that were in the bulletins that weren't in this online database, which is a little concerning. Some of the things that were missing were apparently some pieces of what exactly was being exploited. So some of the indicators that you might look for to see if you're vulnerable. So the jury is still out on whether or not this will be a good thing. I think ultimately it probably will be. The first month or two, as Microsoft is working out some of the details, some of this crucial information may not be there yet, but it's going to be a change. It's going to be a change to the way we've consumed the patch information from Microsoft for nearly 20 years now. So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm resistant to change. So I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens with this. But I've been very used to being able to, I know how to read the Microsoft security bulletins and scan through it very quickly and try to figure out, is this one that is important to me or whether it's not? Mm-hmm. And if it's not represented in a similar way, I might get really annoyed or mad. But I guess I'll adapt eventually. So
you'll adapt.
You think about
otherwise, you're in the wrong business.
Yeah, and one of the nice things if they get the bugs all worked out is this new database is supposed to let you filter by CVEs, by knowledge base article number, by product, by release date. They've got a RESTful API, so you could write yourself a Python script to query it and pull back just the information that you're interested in. So it's got some possibilities once they get the kinks worked out. Mm-hmm. But I am a little bit concerned, as the gentleman from Shavlik said, if some of the information that was in the bulletins isn't in the database yet at the moment.
Yep. I guess the facetious side of me is wondering if this will help you figure out more easily how you got hacked.
How? I was thinking it might make it easier for attackers to figure out what should I target that's vulnerable to certain exploits and
And
whatnot.
perhaps automate the process a little bit more.
Right, I can
mean,
write
that
my
works
own
in a
script
good
to
sense
say-
as well as a bad sense. The notion of automation, in fact, a lot of the work around the concept of cognizance, machine cognizance, and to be able to use that as a means to help provide security protection planning. You really have to have an automated means to do it. I guess there's work in being able to use unstructured data and doing it, but the more it's structured, the better off you're going to be in that sense. So perhaps this is a little bit of a precursor to being able to go down that path.
Right, that's true. And I'd be surprised if they didn't have a lot of this data already in some sort of database, but I can't imagine all that stuff that's represented on their website is all just text flat files, but maybe, who knows?
Anyway. I guess I should mention that Microsoft actually did announce back in November that this was going to be happening. Mm-hmm. I hadn't really noticed it, though, until this Computer World blog post a week or so ago that reminding us that the change really happens in February. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess we'll all keep an eye on that one and see how our mileage may vary or experience with the Microsoft bulletins as we go forward into February. So the next story we have is something about the WhatsApp, and I don't know if we covered it last week because I wasn't here, but why don't you tell me what's up with WhatsApp?
Oh, yeah.
You like that?
I like that. It's pretty good. So last week there was a big story in the news. The Guardian had reported that there was a backdoor in WhatsApp's implementation of the Signal protocol. Now, Signal being a protocol and an app developed by Open Whisper Systems, which helps you, it's encryption for text messaging and the like. It's
right, so WhatsApp is like a text message application that you put on your phone or other device. You can text message back and forth, but encrypted.
Right, and it had been around for a while without the Signal protocol. It was just implemented, I think, sometime in the last year. Okay. Don't hold me to that. But the Guardian had reported that there was a backdoor, and they used the word backdoor, in the way that key changes were handled in Signal, claiming that it was possible for someone to change the keys that two users were using without the users realizing it, therefore getting a man in the middle on that message, that conversation. And it was a big deal. And I actually had read the Guardian article. I was kind of surprised that it existed. I was telling people, holy cow, there's a backdoor. What I should have done in the first place was gone directly to the horse's mouth, which would be Moxie Marlinspike, head of Open Whisper Systems. I believe he's head. But he's at least one of the best well-known guys on that team. And he had his own blog post, and he states flat out, there is no backdoor. And it goes a little bit into the technical details. The short version of it is there's a bit of a difference with the way Signal, the app, and WhatsApp handle key changes. In Signal, when a key changes, users are notified. So if I send you a message and my key has changed, your phone will say, hang on a second, Matt's key has changed. You should probably go and talk to him before you accept any other messages claiming to be from him. And you and I would talk in real life, and we'd compare some notes on our phone and say, okay, I've got this key number. You want to update? Okay, fine.
And that technically should be pretty rare that
yes,
when you're conversing with somebody that a key would change. It's not like every time you talk to them that's going to happen. It would be pretty rare. So if it did happen, you would...
Unless you've got good friends like we know who like to play with Android ROMs and every night. And I hope he watches this episode so he understands exactly how annoying it is.
But most regular users
it
would
almost never happen.
Right.
But with WhatsApp, instead of preventing you from continuing that conversation, WhatsApp says, hey, by the way, the keys have changed, and it lets you keep talking.
And it shows you, like, as in your text message stream, it puts a little blob, like another little bubble in there. It says, hey, the keys changed.
And I'm not a WhatsApp user. It might be an option that can be turned on and off. I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
But suffice to say that there is a notification that's possible. So it's not really a backdoor so much as a user experience change, which is what Moxie's stating. And I agree with that. So it's not really a backdoor. But I figured I would try and clarify that a little bit because it was a huge, big deal. People were having a bit of a fit about it last week. And I'd say go read Moxie's blog about the subject. If there's any technical details I've gotten wrong, he's almost certainly gotten them right.
So it's not really a backdoor, but if you are a WhatsApp user and you see in a conversation that you're having with somebody that the keys have changed, that should be something you're like, well, wait a second, maybe I should talk to this person to make sure, did they change their device?
Right.
Or did something happen? Or is somebody really trying to, jump into our
conversation. And one of the things that Moxie points out is that there is an indicator, a double check mark. Once a double check mark appears on a message in either WhatsApp or Signal, it's not, you can't replay that message to somebody else. So all past messages shouldn't be affected if there is a key change. So that's good to know.
Right. So yeah, even if the key, only the ones that haven't been double check marked would be replayed.
Right, anything going forwards from when the key change is noticed would be the ones you'd have to worry about.
Okay.
So I guess stepping back from this, just sort of looking at it, one of the things that has generally been the trend in the past is there's tended to be a lot of attention to the algorithm that gets used for encryption, whether it be Blowfish or AES or whatever. People are always concentrating on the algorithm and what the key length is and things like that. This is an exaggeration, but 99% of the time, the problem isn't the encryption. It's the key management.
Right, or implementation.
And this is an example of where, at least my perception of it, I haven't studied it in detail, but it appears to be where it's almost an unfinished key management. As we just talked about certificates, and for SSL connections or TLS connections, where you get the indicator that the owner of that key has been authenticated or verified by an authoritative source. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, depending on what you consider to be an authoritative source, but the root keys that are in the browsers are considered authoritative sources. This is a case where that type of infrastructure hasn't been put into place, right. And so you don't know who owns that key. You have to manually validate whose key that is. Mm-hmm. And it's just what I would describe as the user experience is complicated because it's sort of unfinished security. They didn't put all the pieces together. Perhaps in the future, though.
I think some of that was intentional. With WhatsApp, I think there was a comment. In the WhatsApp case, the comment was basically they had a larger user base. They were trying to tailor it more towards usability than necessarily ironclad security. So things are there, but usability took the primary.
It's a matter of perception because it's relying on the user's knowledge to make it more usable or to be able to provide the security that is intended to be there.
That's a hard problem to solve, especially with cryptography. Like most people don't have a background in crypto or even a basic idea of what public key, private key is. Trying to educate them on the fly. But if you're using Signal, maybe you can assume that you have a little more education on the subject. I don't know. But always interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems like there should be a solution around this by managing your public-private key yourself, and then I don't know, but whatever.
There's a few places you can go to do decent public key sharing. I think Keybase is one of them, and then Google actually had something called Key Transparency. I've read a little bit about it, not enough to really discuss it intelligently, but the whole idea is a way that you can effectively share your public keys where they need to be shared. So there's some work being done in the area.
Okay. Yeah. It's interesting.
I've forgotten the name of it. Maybe you remember it. There was actually a sort of a community-based trust model that was created some time ago. I think it was ultimately
PGP, Web of Trust.
I think there was something that was a little bit more formalized than that. But it was the concept around that based on who you know, you could become basically a voucher that is be able to vouch for other people's identity, and it was kind of a cool little model that was built up. I think it got just a little bit over formalized and kind of collapsed on itself over time. But that whole idea of being able to, I'm in this community, I know who that is kind of thing, and be able to validate other people's keys. I guess the other thing to sort of point out for your friend that seems to like changing keys a lot, he would probably need to type text messages for about 1 million years before he would actually exhaust the key space that's in there. Now, I guess the one benefit of changing the keys is that if you lose one key, you would only lose the messages that are in that space of that key. Yeah. But more than likely, unless they actually get deleted, you'd lose all the keys together anyway, because wherever those keys are stored, they're
well,
probably
I think
all in one place.
The key changes are not something he's not consciously going, I'm going to change keys again today. It's a function of Signal.
Oh, is that what it is?
So anytime you make a major change like that, it says, well, I don't trust that I'm really the same device. It's time to get new keys.
All right, well, I retract my...
And I don't know enough about Signal, but it seems like you should be able to move your key pair, your private key, over to your new device.
That's a good question.
And then it should just carry forward. But maybe they don't have that built in there, like this key management like you're talking about. So I don't know. Well, but again, I don't know Signal.
That concept is one of my little pet peeves, is that in many cases, the user experience associated with security is what I interpret to be unfinished implementation of the security. That is, building a trust model that is transparent to the user, building the capability to be able to transition between devices without having to go through fancy gyrations or having to generate new keys. Those are things that it's not easy, but there are things that could be done to actually fix those things.
Right. Okay, cool. Well, I guess we'll...
It'll be interesting to see how this evolves over time, to see if they make changes or improvements to it, or if it, maybe they consider it good enough, and that's okay too.
Yeah, I don't use it myself, but I don't really, if you want to see my text messages, knock yourself out. They're not that exciting. So moving on to the internet weather for this week. It's basically dominated by IoT junk. Mirai, all these other botnets like the Lizard Squad ones, etc. 23 TCP, as we've talked about before, telnet scanning. 22 TCP is SSH scanning. This 23.23.1 TCP is associated with a telnet port on these Dahua DVRs, security cameras. 7547, which we've talked about before, is the CPE WAN Management Protocol, CWMP. We're going to take a closer look at all of these, really. 1900 UDP is a Simple Service Discovery Protocol. That's probably people looking for devices to be used as reflectors more than exploit, but I'm not really positive.
Yeah. But I'll point out, one of the things that we were conjecturing about a little bit last week was the notion that perhaps there's an attempt to try to manipulate the NATing on devices, and for devices that have that protocol exposed to the internet.
SSDP, you mean?
SSDP.
Okay.
There's a potential that could occur. I don't think we've done any studies into specifically whether it could occur or not, but that's
I have not,
certainly a legitimate
but
concern.
you're right. I think that there probably is, because that's kind of what it's for, is on the LAN side, right? To be able to client machines,
NAT
to say I want you to open a pinhole port for me or whatever other types of things. So anyway, 6789 TCP is another telnet port, if I remember right. We're going to look at, I have slides on each of these. 3389 TCP is Remote Desktop Protocol. We see that one a lot. 53 UDP DNS, probably looking for DNS reflectors.
Yep.
37777 TCP, did I get it right? Number of sevens? That is a special port for Dahua DVRs again. So Dahua is showing up on the list a couple of times here, and we'll take a closer look at all of these. As to why that is, I have some theories. You guys talked about some stuff last week, but we'll jump into there. This is the most sources probing, which is also indicative of botnet-related activity, which IoT stuff has been all recruited into these botnets. Very splinter groups of botnets. They kind of shift back and forth as people steal them from each other because there's a population of IoT devices out there. And it seems like, we were talking about before the show, people have they're expanding out to other avenues more than just the 23 TCP telnet brute force password guessing. They're trying lots of other techniques to get pools of vulnerable devices recruited into their botnets.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very simple before. We were seeing basically a set of passwords that were being used that were not very complex, not even a big, huge list of passwords that they were guessing. It wasn't even really a brute force password guessing. It was somebody learned the administrative password,
It's like
the default
30 different passwords they try.
And they were going and checking in.
You'll probably get in at 90% of them.
Devices, almost always on really basic ports. Since that Mirai software has become available, it seems others have entered into it. Perhaps, as you had alluded to, the competition for devices has risen, and so it appears that there is a diversity and a significantly more technical advancement in looking for different ways to exploit these devices or expand the repertoire of devices that could be exploited.
Right, yep. Most of the ports are the same here. I think the only exception is the 445 TCP, which is Windows file sharing related to that. Could be people are just looking for open Windows systems that have their anonymous, so you can go access them.
Amazingly
or
enough,
it could be the
like,
configure exploits and things like that that are still, there used to be, I can't It's kind of old. Was it MS-08, 067, something like that?
It was a while ago. It was I think it was 2012,
Was
if
it?
I remember correctly. But it's certainly been around a while. It appears that there are still devices that are infected with that malware.
Oh, yeah.
There are devices. But I think more, at least as much a possibility, is that there are devices that are scanning and looking for Windows machines that are exposed to the internet with weak file shares. You know, if a Windows machine is exposed directly to the internet, there's a good possibility it has weak file shares.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that they tend to be looking for. It could be either of those possibilities, certainly.
Yeah, well, and think back to when we started this show, a few years back. For the first couple of years, 445 was always the top port on that.
It was always the top port.
And now for the last couple of years, since the Telnet stuff took off, it's been down there in 7, 8, 9, and sometimes not even on the graph.
Okay. Yeah, that's very true. But like you're saying, here's the Telnet chart. And this is just a 1 year. I think I've done 3 years before where you can see nothing going up to these volumes. And when we look at this is the number of scan sources. So, last year we were seeing hundreds, maybe 100,000 scan sources per hour, which is pretty significant in and of itself. That was probably still the number one number of scan sources in terms of like a botnet that we'd seen. But now it's like really gone off the charts where we're seeing upwards of 400, 450 at times. Now it's kind of down around 250,000 per hour. But still, significant number of these devices.
Well, I think it's important to point out, I don't know if we've mentioned this very often, but the botnet isn't necessarily scanning, or not the entire botnet necessarily scanning.
Right.
That is, they may have a segment of the botnet that's used for scanning, trying to recruit new devices, another segment that's perhaps even just in reserve, ready to go, but not really doing anything, and then another segment that actually is perhaps sold off or delegated out
Doing
to
DDoS,
do dirty work of whatever type it is.
Bitcoin mining.
And it is also important to consider the fact that it's mostly DDoS attack activity that the community is generally aware of, but that is not necessarily the constraint of these devices.
No,
they could
not
be
at all.
used for, siphoning traffic off from the device that might be going through, or to use it. I'm referring to a case where maybe it's like a small office or a home office router that has been compromised. There's other traffic that's going through there that could listen in on.
Yep.
Or siphon information off of. And then another example, perhaps, if it's a security surveillance camera DVR that's sitting behind a firewall but has the port open to the internet, well, now you've got an inside device that could be used to peruse around on the LAN side, which may presumably be otherwise considered a secure environment.
Right, and you could laterally move around potentially.
Laterally move around and things like that.
And like you said, some of these, we're seeing large botnet activity, but there are some actors that are using some of these devices for other purposes.
Well, and because,
very discreet. You don't know what's happening. They're just using it as a hot point for certain types of activities that are very low bandwidth, very low. You wouldn't even know they were happening unless you're really paying attention. The reason we see the botnet activity mostly is because it's very noisy. DDoS, scanning, when they turn them into those types of things, they're very easy to see because they make a lot of noise. But there are ones that get compromised and other types of actors are doing other things on them.
Well, and those are likely more selective scenarios.
True.
That is, and the botnet, resource management tools, they may be taking a look at where these are located and considering which ones might be lucrative targets. Through reverse lookups or other types of activities. So even though there are organizations that are running honeypots that are observing the activity that's associated with it, the ones that are selected out may be the only ones that get malware payloads that are associated with other activities. So, I'm conjecturing. This is a lot of conjecture on my part here, but the point is we shouldn't be complacent to say this is just DDoS botnet activity.
No,
it could be
definitely not.
It could be much more than that.
Absolutely. All right, so let's move along here. So the scanning activity on 23.23.1 TCP. There's definitely a correlated association I've seen. If you look at Shodan and you look at this port, there's a bunch of devices, Dahua DVRs in Brazil, a couple other countries too, but there's a big pocket of them in Brazil listening on this port, and it's a Telnet port. It's like an alternate telnet port. So I don't know if that's like some OEM manufacturer that has opened this that's using, I don't really know, but it's definitely being used as like a telnet password guessing port. So that's what they're going after there. And it's been shown that those are Dahua. They actually identified themselves as that, if I remember right, on the Shodan data. Activity was pretty significant. It looks like they did a little scan early on here, back around maybe December 8th or so of 2016. It looks like they kind of determined that looks interesting. And then somewhere right before maybe 12/20, December 20th, they really started going crazy scanning on this. 6789, also around December 18th, they started scanning on this port. This is also another alternate type of telnet port on Dahua security cam DVRs as well. So I don't know really why there's so many different ports, but maybe, like I said, it could be different OEM manufacturers are opening different ports for administrative purposes for this. That one is also being scanned pretty heavily lately. And the 7547, this is kind of interesting. We've been talking about this one. There was the incident that occurred in Germany. I forget what
Deutsche Telekom
had an issue.
There were some other ISPs that were.
And there were a few models of devices that actually, they were exposing the TR64 LAN side management protocol
over the TR69 at the same time.
Right, on the same, right, which they shouldn't be exposing that. And so there was also an exploit that was available on some of these devices when they're, obviously not all of them, but the ones that did expose it incorrectly. And then they had this service implemented incorrectly, had kind of almost like a little shell-shocky vulnerability, which in our honeypot, we actually, because there's a lot of scanning on this, right? So we see in our honeypots people trying to hit this port. So we just grabbed whatever they're trying to send to it. And we could see that this is an example of what we received. And it's kind of interesting because in red here, I've highlighted what it actually looks like. So they're sending a post request to the CWMP port on port 7547. And in here, they're trying to reset the NTP servers using the command set NTP servers. And on NTP server 1, they're actually, instead of putting an IP address in there, they're putting a back quote. And then CD var temp, semicolon, CD/temp, and then they do a TFTP to go retrieve it. And then they run shell to actually run the file B. So they're trying to retrieve this file named B from this website or this TFTP server, and then they execute it. And that's how the machine would get infected if it was exposing TR64 and had this bug where they're not sanitizing input properly, because this is like OWASP, 101. If you're taking input from a third party as part of your service and you're not doing any sanitization of input before you do something with it,
those are not numbers.
That's not an IP address, nor is it a domain name.
Right.
So I don't know how, whoever wrote this thing that's parsing this and doing something with it in the back end of this device has a little bit of a bug.
I think it's perhaps, and again, this is, I'm reading into this just a little bit, but it appears that because this affected more than one brand of device and more than one model of device, it appears that there was perhaps some sort of a shared code base that was used in multiple devices, or a reference implementation of the protocol. So it appears that others may have a similar problem, but it may not exhibit the same sort of response. And so in some cases, I've at least heard that there are cases where it just causes the device to act erratically as opposed to actually joining the botnet.
Right.
But in either case, it could create some havoc.
Right. Some other vendor implementations might get this and go, I don't know, and they just crash, as opposed to, I think that actually happened with Deutsche Telekom. I can't remember, but
I don't know
something happened where it actually...
my understanding was they weren't vulnerable to the attack, but they got this traffic and it caused some other unexplained phenomena.
Right. Yeah. So, something might get this and say, I don't know, and it just, instead of actually getting affected and doing what this wants it to do, it just crashed or something went haywire.
And then there were large swaths of the, in the global internet where this was actually causing them to be part of a botnet.
Right.
And the other thing to mention is that the third part of this perfect storm of bugs is that these weren't authenticated, these requests.
Right, yeah, none of this is authenticated. You just whoop, shoot it in there and you're good to go.
Yep.
Speaking of unauthenticated requests, so this last port, 37777 TCP, is been associated with Dahua. So if you look on this unshow, you see tons of them. When you look at them, it's a Dahua DVR service port. I did a little searching around and I found some blog posts from like 2013 that was talking about you can interact with this if you figure out how to talk to it. And it's mostly for management. It's their own management protocol. It's not like an HTTP or something, but you can interact with this port and get the configuration off of it, change some settings on the device, even reset the password on the device and things like that. I don't know that that's what they're doing here because I haven't actually been able to capture one of these in our honeypot, but it's a possibility, and I haven't validated that that's the case either. I think last week you were talking about, it looked like they might have been trying to change some universal plug and play things, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's still under, because there were, I guess, discrepancies pointed out that appear that the type of activity they're trying to perform would be valid for a security surveillance camera DVR, perhaps. It might be valid for a home router. It looked like they were trying to manipulate the firewall controls or something along those lines. And so I don't think we ever came to a conclusion about what is actually taking place. There were some theories that were floating around. What you've described appears to be something I think a little more perhaps closer to what may actually be happening.
Okay.
So
well, maybe we'll actually be able to capture one in our honeypot and see what it looks like at some point in the future. And that might get us a little closer to understanding it. Anyhow, that's another one. So like I said, looks like there's a lot of these actors out there very hot to trot, scoop up Dahua DVRs because they're targeting at least 3 of the top 10 ports are related to that model of DVR system. Not to say that's the only one, it's not, but there are a lot of them out there. So, all right. So with that, that's the show for today. Thanks for joining us. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at attthreattrack@list.att.com. You can also find the AT&T ThreatTraq program on the AT&T Tech channel. It's also available on YouTube and iTunes. Follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATTBusiness. I'd like to thank you, Jim, for joining us this week. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Brian. And I'm John Hogoboom. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.